Whenever you are dealing with objects, it is important to understand the keyword this. And since JavaScript is such an object-focused language, the keyword this becomes a crucial topic. The binding of this, what this represents, can sometimes be difficult to understand. The thing that makes it difficult to understand is this is determined at runtime. And depending upon what happens within the code, it can be something different. But simply ignoring it because it's difficult to understand won't get us anywhere. There are some concepts that can help us in understanding the keyword this. So let's first take a look at those concepts. Now, understanding this, or understanding what the value of this is in a particular situation, which can also be called this binding, what is bound to this, is based upon some established principles. So let's first describe what this is. This is established at runtime when a function is invoked. This is determined by how a function is invoked, not where the function is defined. So it really doesn't matter where in the code you've placed the function. That doesn't determine what the value of this becomes. How that function is invoked will determine that. And finally, this is a reference to an object. So the value that this becomes is always an object. That we can say up front. It will always be an object. What that object is determined how a function is invoked, not whether or not the function is associated with an object. Now, many times when a function is associated with an object, when it is an object method, the value of this is that object. But that's not always true, so I don't want to say that as a statement to cover what this becomes, what this is. Now, this is not, it will never be the function. Though it is established when the function is invoked, it is not the function. It is always an object. So remember that. Now, one more thing I want to say about this, and that is the binding of a value to this, which we can call this binding, can be implicit, meaning it is set by the JavaScript engine, or explicit, meaning it is set by you. Something you do in the code determines the value of this. Those are some principles we want to keep in mind as we view some examples. So let's look at some examples that will help us understand this binding in a couple of different scenarios that you may encounter. So let me jump to Sublime. Here I've set up a very simple function, fun1, and all it's doing is logging to the console the value of this. So if I were to invoke fun1, let's go ahead and see what we get. If I open up the console, we get the window object. Okay, so that probably isn't a surprise to you. We would expect to get the window object. Basically, this is being invoked in the global space. Since I'm using a browser, the global object is window. Therefore, technically, it's being invoked by the window object. We could also invoke it like this. That might make a little more sense of why the binding of this happens to be the window object. Now, what happens if I add another function here? And what this function does is basically invoke this function. That's all it's going to do. So let me comment out this one here. And then down here we'll invoke fun2. Now what is the binding for this? Well, once again, it is the window. Now, you may look at this and say, well, in JavaScript, functions are objects. So why isn't this referencing the object here? Because that is calling it. Well, when we're talking about the binding of this, and we're referring to that it must show an object, we're talking about JavaScript objects, not specialized objects like functions or arrays or things like that. But we're talking about actual JavaScript objects. So in the case of functions, whenever a function is invoked, the value of this is going to be set to the global object. Now, there's one case where that's not true, and that's if we're using strict mode. So if I come up here and put useStrict, basically what useStrict does is it tells the JavaScript engine to use a stricter form of syntax. So there's certain things that aren't allowed. One of those is the setting of this to the global object. So now, when we do this, it comes back undefined. This is undefined. So if you use strict mode frequently in your code, then this isn't going to be bound to that global object, and that's something to be aware of. All right, now let's take a look at objects, because this is really where this is used when we're working with objects and we're trying to refer back to an object with this. So let's see how that works out. So I'm going to define an object here, obj1, and I'm going to put a name property just so we can keep track of the object a little easier. And then I'm going to put in a method. And all this method's going to do is the same as what we've done before. It's simply going to log this to the console. Now, when we do obj1.fun, we invoke that. You can probably guess what this is going to reference. It's going to reference this object because we are invoking it from the obj1 object. That's how we're invoking that method. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Sure enough, that's the object we see, obj1. So using those rules, it's established at runtime, and it's determined by how it is invoked. And this is being invoked by that object. Okay, let's add to this a bit, make it a little more interesting. So I'm going to create a second object. Once again, I'm going to give that a name property so I know for sure what objects I'm referring to. And then we will do a fun method in this one. However, this time we're going to reference obj1.fun. All right, put some returns in here, so I move that code up a bit. Now, what is going to happen when we do obj2.fun, when we invoke that? What object will this refer to? This is an important exercise, I think. So let's save this, and let's go ahead and refresh. Notice that the second one, obj2. So let me go ahead and remove this one so we can keep everything straight. Do that again. It is obj2. Now, that illustrates the important point that it's not where the method is defined that's important, but it's how the method is invoked. And that's the rule we were talking about. It's how it is invoked that determines the binding of this. So since this is invoked based upon obj2, that is what this is bound to, is to this object, not this object. Now, let me do one more thing to help illustrate this point. I'm going to do a set timeout command. Now, if you're not familiar with set timeout, basically what it does is just execute some code after a certain length of time. Now, the first parameter that you pass in is the code you want to execute. So I'm going to say obj1.fun. That's what I want to happen. I'm going to do that after 1 second. That's expressed in milliseconds. So now, what is this going to be bound to? Remember, it has to do with how it is invoked. Well, how is this one invoked now? Let's go ahead and take a look and see what happens. And I've still got 2 going on here, so let me comment out that one so it doesn't confuse things. And as you can see, it comes back after a second as the window object. Now, why did that happen? Well, because now this code is being invoked by the window object. Set timeout is controlling what code is running. And set timeout is established in the global space. Therefore, the value of this becomes the global object. So you can see by these examples why determining this binding in JavaScript can sometimes be a little bit difficult, because it's not lexically bound. It's not how we enter the code that determines the value of this. It is how it is invoked. Now, we can also explicitly bind this. There are methods available to do that. And I want to make you aware of those as we conclude this discussion on this. But basically, call, apply, and bind are methods that allow us to bind this in a way we choose. Now, another structure to be aware of that affects the binding of this is an arrow function. Arrow functions practice lexical binding. And so it's a bit different than the kind of functions we've been using in here. Now, as you can see, understanding this could be a topic that could go on for a while. And in some of my courses, I spend quite a bit of time on this because it can be quite involved in JavaScript. It's not always a simple thing to determine. But once you understand the rules like what we've talked about here in this topic, you are better able to understand and see why things are happening the way they are in JavaScript. And that's important. It's important to understand why the value of this changed with something you changed in your code. And you see that occur and you go, ah, I know that happens. And those experiences build up on one another and you begin to understand this in more and more depth. So those are the basic rules for this binding. All right, let's move on.